Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Welcome to the Yiboneh Beit Midrash. Welcome home to Torah. I have a little bit of a sore throat. I hope I don't have any coughing fits. So far, so good. First of all, I want to welcome everybody back. And next week I have a wedding. One of my students is getting married, so there won't be a shir next Thursday night. We are in Parshat Vayigash, chapter 47, verse 8. And then we're going to deal with verse 21. Now, this is unbelievable. We're going to get into the thoughts of Pharaoh when he asks Yaakov how old he is, which is absolutely fascinating. We use the Yakar as the basis for our discussion. You can find the source sheets, a link down below in the description box. Also, this is the end of the secular year, and of course we do a fundraising campaign. We have not yet even reached 50% of what we're trying to, our goal, trying to raise. However, there's a few days left. So please, if you enjoy these, not just mine, but any of the videos that Yiboneh puts up, any of the classes, feel free, absolutely free. Nobody's holding you back. There's no restraints, except your own evil inclination to give. But of course you choose who you give to, and we should be, hopefully, on your list. We have so many good things coming up this year. And without any further ado, that link is down below, and you can give freely. So let's begin with the second part of tonight. We're going to deal with a very important concept called Gerud. What does it mean to either convert or to be a stranger? And how important is it that a Jew must feel that way? And why? And how he has to treat others who are, whether it's a ger tzedek, a complete convert, or even a ger toshav, which is a righteous Gentile. But we don't have that full status today, but nevertheless, there are things very similar to that in the way we treat righteous Gentiles. So here we go. We're going to begin with chapter 47, verse 8. And the words we're focusing on are Kama Yemei Shnei Chayecha. Now, just to get a running start, because I do have here on the English source sheet, let's say we're going to be dealing with verse 8. Let's just see 7 through 10. And we're going to see the Rashi on that. Believe it or not. Yeah, okay, let's start. So Yosef brought his father Jacob and stood him before Pharaoh. So this is like probably the first time Yaakov is actually meeting Pharaoh. And Yaakov greeted Pharaoh. Now in the Hebrew it says he blessed him. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, and I think that's very important. We'll see why. How many of the days of the years of your life? That's literally the words we just read. Kama, how much? Yemei are the days. Shnei means years. Chayecha. But let's just say he basically asked him, how old are you? Now, why would anybody ask somebody that question? That's a very, at least in Western civilization, if it was a woman, it would be considered probably rude, unless she was like, very, very, very young. But basically, it sounds a little bit odd. So the reason, we're going to see why he asked him this, is because Yaakov looked very, very old. Still doesn't seem like a very polite thing to do, but he did it. Let's read on. And Yaakov said to Pharaoh, he answered, the days of the years of my sojournings, which in Hebrew are Yemei Shnei Migurai. So I was like a ger. I was wandering about. That is his answers for 130 years. The days of the years of my life have been few and miserable. Now, you can have a whole shir on what might be wrong with that answer, right? We're not going to deal with that, okay? We're really going to deal with just what went on in Pharaoh's mind that he asked this question. But nevertheless, we will deal with this idea in the second part, because he does use the word again. Well, at this point he says, Ma'at v'roim hayu yemei shnei chaya, right? They were few and not easy, basically, and they have not reached the years of the lives of my forefathers, meaning Abraham lived 175 years. Yitzhak lived 180 years. Now, he was only 130 years at the time. He did live another 17 years. But we're going to get into that in the second part. We're going to refer back to it. But he continues and says, in the days of their sojournings, referring to Abram and Yitzhak, his forefathers, as in the Hebrew it says, Migureihem, that they were wanderers. We'll see what that really means. And then, as the pasuk ends, or the last verse, verse 10, and Yaakov blessed Pharaoh and left his presence. Again, the same words as in verse 7. V'yavarech Yaakov es Pharaoh. Did he bless him twice? We'll get into this. Okay, so that is the verses we're going to deal with. Mainly, Kama Yemei Shnei Chayecha. How old are you? Now Rashi begins by telling us when he tells him how old he is, the days of my sojourning, the days of my being a stranger, a ger. All my days I've been a stranger in the land. That means Yaakov lived as a stranger. And this is going to play a very important part, especially in the second, well, let's say even this now. Okay, then it says, so Yaakov blessed. But we already saw he blessed twice, or seemingly. First when he met Pharaoh, and when he departs from Pharaoh. So Rashi says, according to the custom of all those who leave the presence of the princes. In other words, Pharaoh's like a royalty, like a prince, and when you depart from them, and they then bless them and take their leave. But it does say those same words when he first was introduced. So we're going to have to deal with that. Now it says that now what blessing did he actually bless Pharaoh with? That the Nile should rise at his approach. We're going to see what's going on here. First of all, when Yaakov went down to Egypt, the famine stopped. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. That Yosef had the dream that there were going to be 7 years of famine. Beginning 7 years of plenty. And then there were going to be 7 years of famine or drought. So therefore, one of his greatest ideas was, while there's plenty, let's put everything in storage and we'll have what to eat from during the 7 years of drought. However, those 7 years of drought never came to be. Because as soon as Yaakov came down to Egypt, that's as far as this is our tradition, that the famine ended. Now, I think this is the key here. When Yaakov came down, the Nile rose. Now, it rose on his behalf. And the blessing here that Yaakov is giving to Pharaoh is, it shouldn't just rely on me, but basically whenever you approach the Nile, the water should rise. I think that's how we were going to read Rashi for now. That the Nile should rise at his approach, because Egypt does not drink rainwater. Remember, God says, I'm taking you, the Jewish people, out of Egypt. They're into idol worship. They basically think of intermediaries, right, in order to get to God. So basically, the Nile was a intermediary. It was a god for them. At the same time, God says, I'm taking you out. You're going to go to a place where you have to rely on the rains from heaven. You need to have a direct relationship with me. Okay, because it's it's a nikshal. It could be a stumbling block. When all your needs are taken care of, as the Nile so consistently produced water, they never had to look to heaven for water, but they looked down at their feet. Interestingly enough, so since Egypt does not drink rainwater, but the Nile rises and waters it. In other words, they make canals. You had a farm off the delta somewhere in Egypt, so you basically just get a shovel and start digging and create a canal in order for the water to for the water to how do I say this, to basically irrigate your farm. Now Rashi says, and since Yaakov's blessing, meaning Pharaoh would then come to the Nile and it would rise and greet him and water the land. Okay? Now that's, Rashi brought that from the Midrash, and I have underlined in number 2 that when Yaakov went to Pharaoh, this is the Midrash, in Midrash Tanchum and Noso, Kaf Vav, it says, when Yaakov went to Pharaoh, he did not depart from him until he blessed him. And how did he bless him? he said to him that the Nile, which we're going to say the Nilus is the Nile, would rise to his foot. And where do we know this from? From our verse, chapter 47, verse 7, and Yaakov blessed Pharaoh. Very strange, because Rashi's bringing down, actually the Midrash is bringing down the first verse, when he first greeted him, and yet it's referring to when he left him. So maybe we'll deal with that shortly. Okay, let's go into the Yakar itself. So, it says, Lefi shehugad leparo, that Yaakov said to Pharaoh, right? What did he say? Well, first he said he was going to bless him. But one second. Shekasher bo Yaakov hayanilus ola l'ragalav. That's all we know from the Medrash and from Rashi, that when Yaakov came, the Nilus, the Nile, would go up to his feet. Whose feet? I think this is how we understand it. Originally, when Yaakov came, the famine stopped because it rose up to his feet. And that's what it means. He blessed Pharaoh in the beginning. And at the end, because it says the same words again, that he blessed him because he basically said, what I have been able to do, meaning that the Nile rises when I'm around, so it should happen for you. And I haven't seen anybody say it, but this is what makes sense to me based on my ability to discern the pasukim. Now, the Yakar says, "V'haya Paro sameach al zeh me'od," meaning on what? On Yaakov's original coming. We all know that when Yaakov came, the famine stopped, and that's because the Nile rose. There's no doubt about it. And so Pharaoh was very happy about this. V'chashav. I told you we're going to get into Pharaoh's head. What was he thinking? He thought, Shekol zman sheYaakov chai, that as long as this man, Yaakov, is alive, Ya'aleh hanilus l'raglav le'olam. Remember, we're not dealing with who's saying to what, so we have to understand. The whole time that Yaakov's alive, Pharaoh's thinking that the Nile would go up consistently to his feet. V'yashke es pnei ha'adamah, and then would irrigate the face of the land, as I described how the delta of the Nile works. Pretty flat land, pretty easy to create this canal, and water irrigate your fields. The kasher ra es Yaakov. Now, when he saw Yaakov for the first time, how did Yaakov look? Hine, hu dal. Dal means weak. I mean, it could mean poor, but in this, we're talking about poor physically. He was weak. The kachush, another word for weakened. The rakot basar, and very thin-skinned. I think we could try to understand, the older you get, the more wrinkled you may become. And so therefore he was very thin-skinned. Kamishpat zkeni, just the way that the natural ways of old people are. Now, what did Pharaoh think? Chashav Paro, shavadayhu muflag bizikna. I have a feeling this guy is at his last breath, right? He certainly reached the pinnacle of his old age. And therefore, hayom o machar yamut. Maybe, perhaps, today or tomorrow, he's gone south. He's gone west. However you want to say it, in Hebrew we say niftar, and he would be exempt from all the mitzvahs because the dead do not practice life, right? Now, Im Kain, if that's true, that this is what he was thinking, then b'mai simchu mitzrim. Why would the Mitzrim be happy, or why would Pharaoh be happy? Because if this guy brought a blessing with him, and tomorrow he's going to die, that blessing would disappear. So what kind of happiness? This is a very, we might say, a very short term or short-lived happiness. What kind of happiness is this? Because the obvious conclusion is that in his death, the Nile would then revert back to its original level. Now, I think you understand why I'm thinking that when it says he blessed him twice, or it doesn't say blessed him, it says he blessed him when he first met him, and it says he blessed him when he left. So it must be the way the first blessing is, that was the Nile rising on account of the tzidkis, the righteousness, just the presence of such a righteous person being in Egypt, such as Yaakov, and as we just described, that he actually blessed Pharaoh, that whenever Pharaoh would come to the Nile, that the Nile would rise as well. Now, this is why the question was asked. Al Kain She'elo, that Pharaoh says, how old are you? Kama Yemei Chayecha. Now, the answer that Yaakov gives is very important. Yemei Shnei Migurai Me'at V'rayim. That the days of my life of sojourning, again, the Hebrew is from the word ger, migurei, migurai, in this case, wandering about, meaning that if someone had a very cushy life, I don't know if that, let's say a privileged life, where they didn't have to work that hard, they didn't have to carry refrigerators up on their back to the fourth floor, without an elevator on a daily basis, right? You had more of a cushy life. You don't look so old. You don't age as much. But when people are working really hard in coal mines or whatever, in a very physical sense, it may look like they age quicker. And I think that's what he's going to say here. So now, what is the Clear Cards explaining? What was the answer of Yaakov? Shalom mechamat rov yomim hu kol kach chechush v'razah. It's not because I'm old that I look so thin and weak and frail like an old person, but rather ki mechamat pachad v'umigur misaviv. The reason I look so old, because I lived with a lot of stress in my life. I lived with a certain fear. When you're living around, you don't know. I mean, I can make up all kinds of stories because I really don't know what it's like, but you don't know where your next meal's coming from. You don't know where you're going to wake up the next morning, or where you're going to have to sleep the next night, right? Or how you're going to wash your clothes, or how you're going to shower. I mean, if you're really a nomad, and I've been around nomads in Israel, here in the desert, and sometimes they don't shower or even bathe for 6 months at a time, during the summer months, that is. But someone who's a little bit more concerned, might live in a certain type of fear of maybe just security-wise, So anyway, this is what he's claiming, his answer, why I look so old. Because of this girut, because of this life as a stranger. That's what ger is, stranger, an alien. If I can still use that word, an alien. Shalomech, and then he goes like this. Ki et asher yigurti yavo li. In fact, it's so interesting because the word ger, and he's using the word yigurti, and we're going to use the word migurai, it's still related to the actual word of fear, of pachad. And then he goes on and says, V'kama tsaros tzurot ba'am tachotai. This is referring to how many troubles and pains have I been carrying around in my backpack, right? We all carry, many of us carry this trauma of whatever it is we lived with at maybe an earlier age, maybe even a later age, but especially younger, as kids, we hadn't fully developed, and perhaps some of the things that seem normal to other people, to a child, it's extremely exaggerated. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but as a developing person, these things we carry with us the rest of our lives. And of course, we have to deal with them. But nevertheless, he really had. We spoke about this before. First of all, his whole competition in the womb with Esav, let alone how he had to bargain and negotiate in order to get the firstborn status, and then the hatred and the being chased by Esav, and of course going all the way to find his wife, and then being tricked by Lavan, and having to work basically for 20 years in order to leave Lavan with some kind of, something in his purse, so to speak. Alai hayu kulana kol meshek zman shloshim umat shana. Basically, he was telling Pharaoh, it was regarding all these pains that existed for me throughout these 130 years, besides the fact that I cut myself short. But basically, the biggest pain, or one of the most painful things in his life, was the sale of Yosef. His son was missing, and there was no closure, and that was, I'm sure, extremely traumatic. He even lost the sense of prophecy. So a prophet can only be a prophet if he's sameach, if he's happy. And we all know that Yaakov was quite, I'm not going to use the word depressed, but he was traumatized by the sale of his son. So now we understand why he says, Mat Rayim Hayu Yemei Chayai, that short and miserable, or few and miserable, were the days of my life. But then it goes on. The rest of the verse says, V'lo hisigu et shnei chayei avosai. I didn't live. I haven't yet lived. Now, that's, we think of it like this. When we first read it, we think, okay, so he's complaining, he's going to die, he's really only going to live a few more years, that he hasn't reached, or maybe that he thinks he won't reach. No. Meaning the lifespan of his forefathers. The way the Yakar reads it is, V'yesh liyo tikva. Remember, the response of Pharaoh when he saw him was, whoa, this guy's going to die any minute. So the actual answer that the Yakar is explaining that Yaakov gave to Pharaoh was, don't worry, you have nothing to fear. I'm going to live out a much longer life than what you see today. I'm not going to die tomorrow. Did he know he's going to live another 17 years? No, but 17 years is almost like a generation. So he says, Yeshli od tikva legia leperak abba. I have hope that I'll reach close to that age. Shahaya chai shmonim umat shana. Meaning that my father lived 180 years. I expect to live quite a few more years. Don't worry. As we say in Hebrew, in Israel, al tidag, don't worry. Remember, my grandfather Abraham, my father Yitzhak, they lived to 175, 180 years, and they also had the pains of being an alien. They made sure that they never established cities. They didn't even become great in agriculture. They really were living a nomadic lifestyle, moving around like aliens. And he's telling him, remember in the verses, that referring to his own parents as Migorei and Mugarehem, that they also had these troubled lifestyles. I may look old, but I expect to live a longer time, just like they did. They also experienced these troubles as aliens. Now, I just want to stop here for just 1 second, because I want you to know, this is the essence of a Jew. Abraham left Mesopotamia. He left this place called Ur Kasdim. This is the whole name of Ivri. He was a Hebrew. Hebrew means Ivri. We're going to see that word shortly. Ivri means to pass over. It means to move about. It actually means to be nomadic. Okay? And we'll see it shortly. Basically, he crossed over from a land and a place full of idols and illusions and fake news, and he came to Eretz Yisrael, to Eretz Canaan, where you just breathe the air, you breathe in the wisdom, and it's the land of truth. Okay? So that's the essence of an Ivri, of a Jew, of Hebrew. Now, even though we just got done saying that basically he's claiming, I have hope to live a longer life. My own parents or grandparents, they had troubles and they lived a long time. And mikom makom harichu yamim. See, nevertheless, they had a long life, so you don't have to worry. I'm not going to die tomorrow. Lechak nochad lashon. Now the Yakar is explaining why the language migurehem was used gam kape avotav, referring to his own forefathers. Okay, so this is really just laying the foundation for what we're about to get into, because whatever we just learned implant in your memory because we're about to, I think, expand upon it somewhat in verse 21. See, verse 21 says, V'ta'am ha'avir la'arim. What did Yosef do? So let's look in the English. It's verse 21. So it says, and he transferred the populace to the cities. I would not have used the word transferred, but it's okay. It certainly means that. Move. I would have said moved, but it means the same thing. And so the English translation is he transferred the populace to the cities from one end of the boundary of Egypt to its other end. So he basically took people who were living in certain cities and moved them to other cities. And he moved, I'm assuming he moved all the people who didn't live in cities, or most of them, into the cities. So basically, people did not live in their own homes. They might have lived, families lived in these homes for generations. You wake up one morning, everybody's living in someone else's home. Whether it was someone who lived in the burbs, in the farm areas, or even if you lived in a city, you were transferred to another city. Let's look at Rashi before we go into it. And he transferred the populace. Joseph transferred them from city to city, so that they would remember that they have no more share in the land, meaning you don't even recognize your own house. It's not like part of a long heritage. And he settled those in one city to another. Now this is going to be very important what we're about to say in this Rashi, because the Yakar is going to seem to argue, I wouldn't even say argue, seem to be dumbfounded by this statement, not understanding it. And by the end he will explain it, perhaps in the way you might have read it the first time. But most people would not have read it this way the first time. Let's say they might have read it very superficially or without any deep understanding. And what the Yakar will do is, I would say, intellectually challenge Rashi, the statement of Rashi, and then rebuild it or reconstitute it in the same way Rashi did, but with a deeper and better or clearer understanding. Okay, so the second part of Rashi says, Scripture didn't have to write this except to let you know about Yosef's praise. This is actually a praise to Yosef, that he moved the entire population around. Why? Why was that a praise to Yosef? That his intent was, he intended to remove the stigma from his brothers. What stigma? We don't know. Until we see, Rashi says, so that they, the Egyptians, would not call them exiles. Ger. Again, the word ger. So they wouldn't call them golim. That's the word in the Rashi and in the Gemara in Chulin, 60b. But nevertheless, so the Egyptians would not call them exiles. What's the problem with being called a ger or being exiled? We'll see. There's a lot. There's a lot to unpack. So let's begin with the Yakar. The Yakar begins by saying our verse, but he only quotes 4 words. V'ta'am ha'avir, that's the word Ivrit, Hebrew, la'arim. He moved or transferred the population to the cities. Rashi in the Hebrew, he quotes lahasir cherpa me'el achiv, that he intended to remove the stigma or the shame from upon his brothers. Shelo yomru, so that the Egyptians will not say, golim hema, you guys are exile, you guys are aliens. You have no home. Is that a bad thing? And Yosef thought, yeah, especially if they were the only ones. See, we're going to get into the Yakar. He's going to say, see, every Egyptian now knew what it felt and wouldn't make the accusation, or let's say the stigma. The stigma is that you are shamed by the fact that you have no family home. You don't have this ancestral heritage. You're basically a nomad. And I guess you are lower class. You are poor and homeless or aimless, and that would be a stigma that could be applied to the Jew. Now, why is it so important that we experienced it and they experienced it? Let's see. First of all, what is bothering the Kli Yakar? The Kli Yakar right away says, V'rachoku. I'm not happy at all with this explanation within Rashi. Now, Rashi got it from an earlier source, and Rashi felt this is the most pinpointed explanation of the verse. We call it Pashat Pshat. This is the reason why Yosef moved them about, the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians themselves will not say, you're aliens, because we ourselves are aliens. You're not the only ones. You're not, a unique group here that is considered a lowly group. The Kli Yakar said this is very rachok. He gives two reasons. The first reason he considers it, he's bothered by Rashi. The first reason he's bothered by this explanation of Rashi, he says, really now? Sheba'avur to'elet katan zeh? For such a small benefit? Yibalbel Yosef kol haaretz? Yosef is going to uproot the entire land of Egypt and mix everyone around from different houses? That's a huge effort for such a small benefit. So I'll just give you right now some ideas that obviously what the Kli Yakar is going to explain is this was not a small benefit. This was huge. It was so huge, well, we'll get into it. You just stay tuned. It was so huge, remember that the Torah goes out of its way to teach us something regarding this. And furthermore, Shalo Yikare Goyle Vasura Ki Imi Shahoyalo Nachlat Sada Vakerem Vigola Mehem. The Kli Yakar is also bothered by this explanation of Rashi is why in the world why would they call us exiles? Why would they call us exiles? I mean, I get why they would call us, but why should it bother us? We have been, it's true. We are exiles, we are aliens. It's the truth. Why should that bother? In other words, so Rashi says that you wouldn't call a person in exile and have been removed from an ancestral plot unless they actually had an ancestral plot. Meaning unless they had some kind of field that they were planting and cities they lived in and vineyards that they benefited from and then been removed. The Jewish people, I say the Hebrews, Abraham, Isaac, and even Jacob, as long as he lived in Israel, they never had this. They never planted. Yeah, they dug wells, but they never really planted and had, right? When Avram bought Hebron, part of Hebron, the Mars Machpelah, he bought it for burial site. And that was it. He was only buying it for burial site, not necessarily for planting. Although if you ever go to Hebron, it's beautiful. There's these big, old olive trees all over the place. And you could tell that it was a very lush place to grow things. And they had vineyards, of course. There's really nice produce comes out of Hebron. But nevertheless, that was not Abraham's doing. So here we explain, Avo Yaakov loya tosha b'shum makom. Not only were Abraham and Isaac not, connected to the land in a physical way, but even Yaakov was never considered a toshav in any place. Toshav meaning, I would say settler, but let's say a resident, like a permanent resident as opposed to an alien. The kola avos hayugerim. That all of our forefathers were these aliens wandering around. And when did that begin? It began with the birth of Yitzhak. Ki kavar hutchal hagerut mishanolad Yitzhak. Right? If you go back to the Brit Bein Batarim, the covenant between the parts in Genesis chapter 15, right? So God says you're going to be strangers in a land that's not yours. You're going to be afflicted. Eventually you come out with a great wealth. So this was 430 years before we left Egypt. But it was exactly 400 years we left Egypt from the time of Isaac's birth. Yitzhak's birth, and therefore this whole Brit, this covenant between the parts, took place 30 years before Isaac was born. And so the 400 year, because there's I wouldn't say contradiction, but there's one place that's 400 years, another place 430. Truth is, we were only in Egypt anyway 210 years. God cut it short. But we left on the 400th anniversary of Isaac's birth. Okay? Specifically, we had 400 years of wandering from the time Isaac was born. So basically, that's what he says. Kivar hutchal gerus mishinolad Yitzhak. This the clicking the time clock, the clicking time clock happens when Isaac is born. V'lo mitzinu shechashashu avos lezeh. We don't even suspect that the avos, that the forefathers settled anywhere. They were always gerim, meaning they were always aliens and wandering. And as I mentioned from the beginning, that when Abram left Ur Kasdim, I mean, he was ridiculed. He was this revolutionary, thinking in terms of monotheistic or ethical monotheism, and he was ridiculed, right? Separated. He really did separate himself from the non-Jewish population or the non-Hebrew population, and came to Eretz Israel. Okay, so it's very important to think about, even especially as a righteous Gentile, that you could separate yourself, and that's what Avram did, from the baloney of the society around you. Of course, if you live in a society, you can vote and change things and make a more civil society. You should. But anyway, let's go on to the next paragraph, because now the Yakar will explain a lot of the reason behind this transfer of the Egyptians. Remember, Yosef was praised because he removed any stigma or shame from upon his brothers. Not entirely, and it was specifically only the brothers. Obviously, later on, after we were there 210 years, so people in the second, third generation, they obviously felt they do have a nachlat avot, a family plot, and they've been living there for generation or generations at that point. So the Yakar says, the yoter nachon lefarish kol habilbul halazeh. He's going to say that this is much more proper, much more clear to explain the entire chaos and transfer of population that Yosef did. And he explains it like this. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 19, it says, V'yahavtem es hager. You should love the convert, the ger. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Because you were gerim, you were aliens, you were not tied down with a long list of, permanent residents as ancestors. Ki kol mi shelo hayager miyamav. Now this is very interesting, because this is actually telling you as a Jew, you must feel, you must experience gerut, alienship, if that's a word, strangeness, not belonging, not anchored down. Ki kol mi, anyone who never experienced this gerus in their life, eino margish betzara shel ger, will never understand, will never know the pain that a ger experiences. And as a result of not understanding, knowing, and I'm really going to use the word empathy, Eino chas al nefesh hager, will not have an empathy towards, and I'm going to add a few other synonyms, pity, care, concern. You won't relate to the ger, to the soul of the ger properly. Aval, but mi shehaya be'atzmo ger, but someone who was an alien, knows what it feels like. Yodei b'tzara shel ger. Therefore, the Jewish people had to experience it. but not to the extent that they would be stigmatized. The stigma, and unfortunately, that's why the Torah has to tell us 36 times to love the ger and to take care of the ger and to be concerned about the ger and to have pity on the ger and care for them. And the truth is ger toshav as well. But again, we don't have that status, but a non-Jew who lives amongst us, also the same concept. Let's say conceptually speaking, one should also have this. Because we have a famous statement, we all know you should love your neighbor as yourself, but we understand it as v'chol da'olav sani, that anything that you hate, anything you do not want done to you, lechavrei lo ya'aveh, don't do to others. What you do not like done to you, do not do to others. And only having this consciousness. Now, it doesn't mean you have to live in an exile, although maybe there are famous rabbis that made and took upon themselves to just experience this. Go and dress differently and go into a different city, nobody knows you, and act like a total stranger and see how it feels. It's an unbelievable exercise in humility for sure, but into trying to understand what a ger feels like. Al kain havir Yosef ha'am la'arim. And this is the very reason that Yosef moved everyone about, even the Egyptians, Kadeshu kulam gerim ba'aretz lo lehem, so that they can really truly feel, also the Egyptians, that they were aliens in a land that was not theirs. For sure the Jews. Now we understand, like it says in, this was in the Brit, the Bein HaBetarim, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. You'll find this in number 7 on the source sheet. God says to Avram, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. And they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. Ki ger yeh zarecha, ba'aretz lo lehem. Now that's a really tough pill to swallow. Now listen to what he says. Ki hatoshavim yu ba'aretz lo lehem. They will basically dwell, they will be living in a land that doesn't belong to them. Kedei sheyargishu b'tzaro shel hager. In order for them to actually experience, and he used the word feel. In other words, the feeling comes from knowing the experience. V'yochol liyot shegam Rashi nischave lezeh. And this is what the Yakar goes back to say. This must be what Rashi meant when Rashi said these words, that it was to remove the shame or the stigma of being a ger. Because he says, Kizu hi hacherpa shecharpum lomar, that this is the shame or the stigma that they would stigmatize or shame them by saying, Goli matem, you guys are, the Egyptians would say to the Jews, you guys are aliens. So, what's wrong with that? We're going to see. V'lu chayfetz Hashem b'tovatachem. Remember, Hashem is only looking out for us. All the going down to Egypt and the oppression was really only to raise us up and to free us, and so we can have this intimate relationship with Him. But we know, isn't it, that God only wants our good? So lama tem golim. So why would we then be put into a position where people would make fun of us and mock us as golim, as being aliens? You know what happened as a result? If we thought that was what God's intent was, mutar lahariya lechem, that it's actually permissible for the Egyptians to, let's say, stigmatize and make it worse for the Jew. No. Al kein ha'avir otam Yosef larim. This is exactly why Yosef moved them around, so that they wouldn't do this, because this is not in our interest. I mean, to go overkill. Obviously, a Jew must feel like an alien, strange from all the people around him, but nevertheless, overkill can actually be damaging. And that's why it says 36 times in the Torah to watch out for them. Because as we're going to see soon, when one does, let's say, oppress or look down on, and the ger feels it, so because they've experienced evil in their lives, because before they did tshuva and became Jewish, it's so easy for them to return. In other words, we're causing people to leave the relationship with God if we oppress them. By oppressing them, it's easy for them. Anybody, like about tshuva, it's easy to go back to where you came from, right? A tzaddik, where someone who's righteous their whole life and never sinned, isn't going to think about going and sinning when he feels oppressed. But it would be more easier for a Baal Tshuva who's already been there to leave, or for a ger, someone who was an alien, to go back. So it's really pushing somebody away from a relationship with God, because they would be more easily persuaded to leave by the oppression caused by either an individual or by society. Kedei sheyuchu lahashiv lehem. So this is the Yakar again, explaining why it's so important that there was a transfer of populations, so that once the Jews are exiled, meaning the Jews are already exiled, but now the Egyptians are exiled. If an Egyptian would say, "You're an alien," the Jew could respond, "Gam atem hachaletem kimonu," that you are just as affected, okay, as we are. You are just as defiled or just as lowly as we are. So there's at least a response. The person doesn't feel that they're being pointed out as being a lower status, because everyone, including the Egyptians, are on that level of alienship. Okay, so now the clear card, the last paragraph ends off with a davar acher, which means alternatively, lekach avirosam Yosef larim. Now we understand this is why Yosef transferred or moved them around to the different cities. Kiro sheyakov b'banav nityashvu be'eretz Goshen. That they saw, or it was seen, or seen too. Yaakov wanted, him and his sons, Yosef also, wanted that Yaakov and his sons live in a specific place called Goshen. Now there's actually an opinion that Goshen was like a finger sticking out from Eretz Yisrael all the way to the west. So it was ki'ilu, as if they actually were living in Eretz Yisrael, but I don't think that's the majority opinion. But basically they would have some kind of holding there. And the verse explains it like that. Yachazu ba, that they would have some kind of inheritance and a holding. Liod lehem achiza v'nachla baretz. So even though the Jews, the Israelites in Egypt, were sure aliens, nevertheless they would go to a place called Goshen, where they would at least have some real estate holding. V'yesh lechush ki berov hayamim. Now there isn't to worry that after many generations or after a long time, yakum melech, there would be a tyrant, a melech aritz, some kind of a tyranny or oppressing government or king. V'yidrosh me'al sefer divrei hayamim, that he would request to look at the books, all the well, here they call it the Taba, look into the registry, who owns what, and for each and every city, shall kol ir v'yoshveh, each and every city that has been established, asher olav katuv zikron kol karka shal mihi, and he could look at and see who are the wealthy families, who are the big plot owners. But whatever, let's say like, the Nazis, Yamak Shemo, they kept very careful records, assuming that perhaps if there was ever a tyrant in Egypt who would go into the records to find out who owns what, V'lo yimtza Yisrael shum zchut, they would see that it's specifically the Jewish people alone that don't have any merit, even though they're living in Goshen. They have quite a holding. Right, it was very good property, and I'm sure they built very nice houses there. They would find out, this tyrannical king or government would see that the Jews have no merit, that their fathers never owned any land. That the Jew could not ever claim to this tyrannical government that this karka, this ground, this plot was in my family for generations. Couldn't say that. And then as a result, Vigarshu mimenu, then as a result, the Jews would be driven out and basically living within Egypt as even worse aliens, status. Al Kain Havir Kulam Arim. This is why Yosef made sure that even the Egyptians were moved around. So you wouldn't have any of these finger pointings and Ad Sheshum Echad Mehem Lo Yeshev Ala Chuzat Avotav, until even the Egyptians were no longer, not one of them was living on his original family plot. Yisrael Ke'echad Mehem, and therefore we would just be just like one of them. We were all Gerim, we were all aliens. Kikulam Yeshvu B'lo Chazakah. As a result, everyone would be basically living on a plot that wasn't originally ours. Now, I want to end with making a few quotes on this whole idea. The Ramban, let me just tell you, there's a Mishnah in Baba Metzia 59b. What is the meaning of the verse? You shall neither wrong a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So it was taught by Rabbi Nassan, don't taunt your neighbor with the flaw you have yourself. So this actually we need to unpack a little bit. So anything that would shame somebody, let's say that. In other words, obviously, you don't want to shame somebody with a flaw. But if you have it, you're going to go out of your way not to accuse your neighbor until you fix yourself, basically. But anyway, don't taunt your neighbor with the same flaw that you have yourself. Now, the Ramban on Shmos, on Exodus chapter 22, verses 20, and I think 21 also, but he says like this: the correct interpretation appears to me to be that he is saying, do not wrong a stranger or oppress him, thinking, as you might, that none can deliver him out of your hand. For you know that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and I saw the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed you, and I avenged your cause. Shem's talking on them, because I behold the tears of such who are oppressed and have no comforter. Hashem will hear, right, the tears, will see the tears, will hear the cries, will have the emotional, if we can just use sekaviyachol, as if a response to the underdog, the one who's being oppressed. And let me just go back. I avenged your cause on them because I behold the tears of such who are oppressed and have no comforter. And on the side of their oppressor there is no power. And I deliver each one from him, from the oppressor, that is too strong for him. Okay. And in another verse, he added this reason: for you know what it feels like to be a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That is to say, you know that every stranger feels depressed and is always sighing and crying, and his eyes are always directed towards God. Therefore, God, he will have mercy upon the person, even as he showed mercy to you back when we were in Egypt, as is written, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up to God by reason of the bondage, meaning that he had mercy on them, not because of their merits. We were actually idol worshippers. We weren't so righteous, and yet, on account of the bondage and the pains that we went through, Hashem has mercy on the oppressed. So it's a real negative thing to oppress others for many reasons, but one, most of all, from a very selfish reason. God's going to take it out on you. You, the oppressor, will suffer because you're oppressing. Okay? And I'm going to give a little bit of a plug for my shir on Tomer Devorah. At this point in time, we haven't finished. We're now going to start number 10 out of 13, with the 13 attributes of mercy, that if you act like Hashem, if you imitate Hashem with these different attributes, you bring into the world mercy, and therefore I'm going to call it a very selfish act to work on your character and be a better person, because it's only going to benefit you in the end. Not only, meaning the main person is going to benefit is you in the end. Of course, it's going to benefit others and the world around you. Okay, when we go to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 through 34, the verse says, when a stranger lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The stranger living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Rashi says on that verse, this implies vexing him with words. Right? Don't say to him, yesterday you were an idolater, and now you come to study Torah, which was given from the mouth of the Almighty. In other words, you're putting him down. You're saying, you don't come from any yichus, you don't come from any solid genealogical background like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or this rabbi or that rabbi, but you're a foreigner, and it was only yesterday you were worshiping idols. Look at you, you're just a green behind the ears, you're a newbie. Now, Ibn Ezra on that verse explains like this. It says, if a convert dwells with you. Now that's mentioned right after taking care of the elderly. So just as Scripture admonished you to honor an elderly Israelite, though he has no power, he's an old guy, so does it admonish you regarding the convert, who has also little power compared to you, meaning he doesn't have a family base that he can call upon for assistance and help, right? He's familyless, most likely. So his little power compared to you, because he's considered powerless simply because he relies on your land under your dominion. Now, under your dominion means, like, again, without family and a solid basis of support, but also, in a certain sense, if it's a ger toshav, especially a non-Jew living amongst the Jews, he really feels that he's under this foreign law, which he has accepted upon himself. But nevertheless, there is this idea. Now the Shadal explains on the same verse, what does it mean, love him like yourself? The nations of the ancient world would only love their own people, and they would defraud other peoples because they saw them as despicable foreigners. Therefore it says here, now keep in mind, it's very interesting because many places that are tourist spots give the locals a discount, and all the foreigners, that's where they make their money. I don't think that's what it's talking about, but you can understand if you bring it down to a real practical level where there's no real monetary benefit, it's a selfish benefit or a phobia. It could be just a phobia. Or you can be brought up as a bigot, right? Anyway, therefore it says here that you need to love him like yourself and act toward him just as you would want. You should act towards him as you would want other people to act towards you if you were a foreigner. This is in accord with what is written several verses earlier as love your neighbor as yourself. Now the Sifra on the Kedoshim explains like this. You shall be to the stranger that lives among you, and you shall love him as yourself. It's written about the Jews in Vayikra, you shall love your fellows yourself. So it's also written about converts. You shall love him, or ger. You shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is the bottom line. Know the soul of the strangers. Get to know what the soul of the strangers is, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And Deuteronomy chapter 10 verses 17 through 19. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of the lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who will show no favor, nor he will take a bribe. He executes the judgment of the orphan and widow. He loves the stranger to give him bread and clothing. So too you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now I'm going to end with one short piece from a very big book. This is Rabbi Yonatan Sachs, passed away recently, Alav Shalom, but he wrote many books, well liked. He writes, he's very articulate in his speech. He was a very good speaker. I think he spoke better than he wrote, but different strokes for different folks. Many people read his books. I love to hear him speak. He said, dislike of the unlike is as old as mankind. This fact lies at the very heart of the Jewish experience. It is no coincidence that Judaism was born in the two journeys away from two great civilizations of the ancient world, right? Starting with Avram from Mesopotamia, as Moses and the Israelites from the Pharaonic Egypt. The Torah is the world's greatest protest against empires and imperialism, their most serious offense. For the prophets, as well as the Mosaic books, was the use of the power against the powerless. In other words, the rebuke of the prophets is constantly looking out for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, against the powerless, the widow, the orphan, and above all, the stranger. Now he says to be a Jew is to be a stranger. Even the word Ivri, Avar, that's where it came from. Abraham left and came over. Aver Hayarden, he crossed over the Jordan. Aver, we say in Hebrew, Oiver Avera, if someone transgresses a transgression. It means to move about. It is hard to avoid the conclusion. That's why people used to call, I don't think they do it anymore, but the wandering Jew. Maybe they're still calling us that, but at least we found a home to where our ancestors came from. Many of us are home. We don't call ourselves wandering Jews anymore. Those who do, here's the address, right here in Eretz Yisrael. Come home. Okay, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that this is why Abraham is commanded to leave land, home, and father's house. Why long before Yosef was born, Abraham was already told his descendants would be strangers in a land not of their own. Why Moses had to suffer personal exile before assuming leadership of the people? I mean, he had to run away, and for 60 years he was away. Why the Israelites underwent persecution before inheriting their own land? And this is interesting because that's exactly what happened before 1948 as well. We had to go through something traumatic. I mean, you can't even talk about it in real terms. Nobody would even believe that such a thing happened as the Holocaust. But we went through horrible things. So he says like this, why the Israelites underwent persecution before inheriting their own land, and why the Torah is so insistent on the experience. We retell the story every year, right? On Pesach, the retelling of the story on Pesach, along with the never-forgetting taste of the bread of affliction and the bitter herbs of slavery, which we do during the Passover Seder, should become a permanent part of their collective memory. Every Jew that I know, you sit there and you eat the maror, you eat that poor man's, the bread of affliction. Know what it's like to have been afflicted. Go back into your own memory for 3,000, almost 4,000 years. So almost 4,000 years ago, we left. We left Egypt. We experienced some of the most bitter parts of our history. Now he ends up by saying like this: it is terrifying, in retrospect, to grasp how seriously the Torah took the phenomenon of xenophobia, hatred of the stranger. It is as if the Torah were saying, with utmost clarity. Remember, I'm reading from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Reason is insufficient. Sympathy is inadequate. Only the force of history and memory is strong enough to form a counterweight to hate. Why should you hate the stranger, asked the Torah. Remember, 36 times. There's an opinion that says 46 times, depends how you read the verses. Because you once stood where he stands now. I can just imagine Rabbi Sachs saying this. You know the heart of the stranger because you were once a stranger in the land of Egypt. If you're human, so is he. If he's less than human, so are you. You must fight the hatred in your heart as I once fought the greatest ruler and the strongest empire in the world on your behalf. That's God talking to you. I made you into the world's archetypical strangers so that you would fight for the rights of strangers. And we do. And we do. It's unbelievable. Just think about it. I mean, just from the 60s when with the racial riots, who was on the front lines standing with the African Americans at the time? It was the Jews. Who stood up for the rights of people? The Jews in all the countries, in all of history. It's unbelievable. So I just got excited. So where did I leave off? Here it is. Wherever they are, I'm sorry. This is what the archetypical strangers are, the Jews. So that you would fight for the rights of strangers, for your own and those of others, wherever they are. Whoever they are, whatever the color of their skin and the nature of their culture, because though they are not in your image, says God, they're in mine. Nevertheless, they are in my image. That's what God is telling you. So they may not be the same color, skin, or the same texture of the hair, or social status in society, but they're created in the image of God. And this is, I think this is an incredible lesson that we should all take to heart. What else can I say? Let's meditate on this, take it to heart, maybe take this exercise and make a personal exile for a few days, a few weeks, if you have never experienced it. And if you did experience it, get in touch with it. Empathize. Have pity and care and concern for those around you. Not just for the stranger, for everybody, but especially the stranger. And with that, I wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and God bless you all, and have a great life, and we'll see you in 2 weeks from now.
It's